hey, it's time to learn more things. Well, really, it's time to review more things. So if you're preparing for the AP Gov exam, this is a place to start. Probably not a place to finish. Anyone else? It's some good news too. All right, so bright slide. We're going to go over the amendments. Now, in the back of our classroom, I have this awesome poster that I picked up in Philadelphia at the National Convention for Social Studies last year. And I bought this from Periodic Presidents, and they make some great posters. I wish I could put one on every desk if I had all the money in the world. Sometimes it's covered up in test time, but if you haven't had a chance, go back and check out these amendments. There's a lot of good information on this poster. It includes the year on the bottom, and on the sides, you'll see some ways that they can be grouped together, and it may help you remember. I'm just going to go through these super quickly, and if you're not sure about it, you should probably go back and spend a little bit more time on them. All right, you don't need my face in this video today. Let's just look at this. All right, so the First Amendment we should all know by now. I hope you know the five freedoms by now. Also know that there's two different parts to the freedom of religion. Second Amendment, right to bear arms. Think of your two arms, and arms being those guns. All right. Third Amendment, quartering of soldiers. For whatever reason, I just always think of a house with three rooms, and that makes me remember it's the Third Amendment. Now, Amendments 4 through 8. These are the rights of the accused. So these are all amendments that do with, like, if you were arrested, let's say, whether it's a civil case or a criminal case, and to make sure that you are protected, that everything is just, that your trial is fair. So what does that mean? It means things like unreasonable search and seizures in the Fourth Amendment, right? That they need a warrant if need be. Fifth Amendment, due process, and also the rights of the accused. You hear things like people pleading the fifth, you don't have to testify against yourself, double jeopardy, things like that. The Sixth Amendment, right? You have a fair and a speedy trial. Seventh, a trial by jury. And the eighth, no cruel and unusual punishment. You can't get beaten up as a consequence if you're found guilty. All right, the Ninth Amendment. Those are basically other rights. One reason the Federalists did not want a Bill of Rights is because they argued, well, what if one of our rights just isn't included here? We're not thinking of something. Does that mean it's not a right? The Ninth Amendment says no. Non-numbered amendments, so to speak, non-numbered rights, other rights are still included here. And that becomes an issue of debate often. The 10th Amendment is that, hey, any power that's not given to the federal government, it's given to the states or even to the people. This was also to appease the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists are the ones who really argued for a Bill of Rights. Many of the Anti-Federalists also thought that the federal government had too much power, and they wanted the states to retain a lot of their rights. So this made them, I don't know if it made it happy, but it made them happier. All right. The 11th is lawsuits against the states. I really doubt you'll see like an FRQ on that with expecting you to know it or something, but it explains how that can operate. 12th Amendment. This is one of the presidential amendments. This is from 1804. Okay, let's know your history. In the 1800 election, you now have a president and vice president who basically don't see eye to eye and everything, who you can say were different parties, right? It made sense that when Adams finished second, he went with Washington. They had a very similar outlook on things. But how was Jefferson going to be a vice president under John Adams? The answer is they really didn't talk about anything. Yeah, that's slightly exaggerating, but not too much, right? And as we say in class, imagine if Trump was Biden's vice president. How would that work right now? Imagine if Hillary Clinton was Trump's vice president. Um, Good luck, right? So this means you have a ticket that the president and vice president run together. This runner-up is not the vice president. All right. Then a very important time. Check out the years here: 1865, 1868, 1870. What is this right after? Right after the Civil War, known as the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment ends slavery. 14th Amendment is for citizenship rights, right? Even if you were a former slave, for example, you are a citizen, and also equal protection. There's a whole lot you need to know about the 14th Amendment: due process, equal protection. Know some court cases that relate to it, like how does Brown v. Board relate to the 14th Amendment, right? But also then the 15th Amendment is the right to vote was not to be denied by race. So uh, it's still only men who can vote, but Black men were able to vote now in 1870. That doesn't mean it always happened easily or fairly. We'll get to that in a second. Then we have the progressive era. So early 1900s, you'll learn more about progressivism in US too. Um, I doubt you'll need to know much about federal income tax, but it's good to know that that's when that started. Popular election of senators is a big deal because before then, the state legislatures chose the senators. This makes it a bit more democratic, let's say. Prohibition of alcohol, that's easy to know. Remember, because it used to be in some states you could drink alcohol at 18, but not anymore. So, 18th Amendment, prohibition. 19th Amendment, that's a super important one too. That gave women the right to vote. 1920, we were supposed to celebrate the 100th anniversary of that, but we were all celebrating COVID instead. That's sarcasm. I hope you didn't celebrate it. All right. Um, where did I leave out 20th? The 20th Amendment, let me explain that first. 20th Amendment, lame duck. So a lame duck is someone who is not going to serve another term, and you already know who's going to be next, but that person is still in office. So think, for example, after the election when Biden won and Trump is still president, but he spends some time as president knowing it's going to end in a few months. That makes you a lame duck. Now, back in the day, um, presidents or even people in Congress were not sworn in until months later, March. You know, the first time it's April, but basically it's March, right? So imagine if you lost an re-election in November, and then you're waiting and waiting and waiting to March. That's really awkward, right? It even can become troublesome in the Civil War when Lincoln is chosen, elected, but it's months before he becomes in office. This amendment moved it up till January. Time wasn't needed to travel in 1930s the way it was in the 1790s. 21st, repeals prohibition. That's easy to remember because when you're 21, you can legally drink, right? All right, now let's go to presidential term limits. That is FDR. Many presidents followed the precedent of Washington of only serving 2 terms, but there was no part of the Constitution that said that had to be. Remember, Hamilton, energetically voted or argued against term limits. Well, after FDR died and people saw him after serving term after term after term after some of another term, they said maybe that's not great. And they put in the 22nd Amendment. Okay, the electoral votes for DC with 23rd, the people there, they're people. They should get electoral votes as well, right? 24th, that prohibits the poll tax. So I put a blue check there because that is one of our voting amendments. So in order to make voting more democratic, having to pay would be a way that would not only discourage but prevent people from voting. So when I mentioned before the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote, if they had different types of tests, like a literacy test or a poll tax, so they had to pay, that would sort of remove people from voting. This can still be debated at times when people say you should need an ID to vote. They say, well, if you have to pay for that ID, is that a form of a poll tax? Something to think about. So that's one of the voting amendments. We also, of course, have the 15th Amendment, 19th Amendment, so that allows Black men to vote, and then men of all races, but that was mostly created for, with black men in mind at the time. Women's right to 19th of oh, geez, women's right to vote, the 19th Amendment, 1920, and then the 26th Amendment, the right to vote at age 18. Notice that's in 1971. What's going on in 1971? We know this. We learned about Tinker Des Moines and New York Times versus the United States, the Vietnam War, right? We can call it that. And if you couldn't vote in some states till you were 21, imagine being at war at 18. Many young men and even women in some cases were killed at that age. So they changed that voting age. Keep in mind, I still joined the military and you can at age 17, but you need parental permission at that point. All right, now let's see. We also have the presidential amendments, the 25th Amendment there, presidential disability and succession. That just explains if the president dies, the vice president takes over. If the vice president is removed, how they should appoint a new one. Who comes next? Is it President pro tem, the Secretary of State? That whole order is explained. Now, of course, the idea before 1967 was already in the process that, hey, when presidents died, vice presidents came in next. That was in the Constitution, but this laid out some more guidelines. Keep in mind, 1967. Do you know the date when President Kennedy was assassinated? All right. That is all the ones. That is all the amendments. Well, we have the 27th Amendment that limits pay raises in Congress. Keep in mind that was one of the original 12 amendments, but only 10 of them passed to become the Bill of Rights. So it was in the works for about over 200 years. That's the last amendment. We have not had an amendment to the Constitution since 1992. That's a good chunk of time. Look, when do you see the longest stretch um, between amendments? All right. Feel free to go back and look more into these, find other ways to remember them. I'll give you some other little ways to help remember these, little dances we can even do. Um, but make sure you know your amendments. Okay, I'm just going through them just for fun. Goodbye.